people, and welcome to the show. It is Wednesday night, and we have lots to talk about. First of all, I'd like to thank you for supporting the show, and please tell your friends and family to support the show on Patreon or to subscribe on YouTube. That's how we spread the word and get a broader reach for the show. There's lots to talk about today, so let's get right to it. Our first topic is Ding Dong, the Rush is dead. Now, some of you have probably seen the headlines that Rush Limbaugh, who died at age 70 today, he died from a long fight with lung cancer. And there was a lot of response to that. But interestingly enough, I tweeted earlier today what I thought was a particularly restrained tweet given what I could have said. And so what I actually said is Rush Limbaugh's suffering is finally over, and so is ours. And apparently it grabbed the attention of right-wing newspaper who published my tweet as an example of how terrible I am for not being sufficiently decorous about his death. I want to make something clear. Rush Limbaugh celebrated the deaths of a lot of people on his show. In fact, for a while, he had a segment on his show going through the names of people who've died of AIDS to celebrate their deaths, right? Rush Limbaugh was a jackass, a racist, bigoted asshole who was hurtful, cruel, dismissive, disrespectful. And the worst part about Rush Limbaugh is that he proved to corporate executives all over America that you can make a buck being a racist ass. And so Rush Limbaugh ushered in Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and all of the rest of the racist ass who make money diminishing, demeaning, and disparaging other people. So am I sad that Rush is gone? Hell no. Hell no. And the people who support him don't have standing to criticize us for not being sad that he's gone, because he wasn't sad when other people died. In fact, one of the things I remember about him was how he mocked Michael J. Fox for Parkinson's disease and was making fun of him and saying that, that Michael J. Fox was pretending that he was sick. Who does that? An asshole does that. Rush is an asshole who has now departed this earth, and he gets to explain himself to his maker if he even gets that far. But I want to make something clear. I've had it with the double standards out there. The people who were cheering Rush on when he was demeaning, disparaging, and attacking people don't have standing to criticize or to clutch their pearls if the people on the left celebrate his death. Live by the sword, die by the sword, asshole. And that's exactly what Rush Limbaugh was. So good riddance. Doesn't mean that what he planted in America has not blossomed. It has. We have a whole lot of Rush Limbaughs now. He's made it cool and acceptable to be a total jerk. There are a whole lot of guys that want to step in his shoes. How can I get rich? By dividing, demeaning, and attacking people who are not like me. Rush made a buck, but he didn't get to take a single one of them with him now, did he? So, he goes to his maker as naked as the day he came into this earth. And he's going to have a lot of explaining to do. Because God don't like ugly. And Rush Limbaugh was ugly, personified. Good riddance to him. And good luck at those pearly gates. That's topic number 1. Let's move on to topic number 2, which is far more substantive and interesting. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of privatization, because it has come up in this context of what's happening in Texas. I talked earlier in the week about coming off of the grid and why Texas decided that it did not want to be on a national grid because it did not want to abide by federal regulations with respect to the maintenance of the grid. So federal regulations, for example, require that energy producers and energy companies put aside a certain amount of their profits to reinvest in infrastructure in their business. Why? Because they don't want people to be paying energy bills over and over and over again, and none of that money going to upgrading or sustaining the system, and instead all going into the pockets of the CEOs and the executives, because that means that when things go sideways, the government has to step in. So what the government says is, no. If you want to have the ability to provide electricity to a city or a state or whatever, you're going to have to abide by certain quality standards, safety standards, environmental standards, and things like that. That's a very good thing, because the people who regulate these utilities, people who do that, are usually elected or appointed, and they know that they're there to protect the interests of their people. So FERC, which is the entity that governs our electrical grid, ensures that all of the entities on this grid are not just taking off of the grid, but they have to be prepared to put energy onto the grid, and that they're always keeping up their facilities so that they can meet the demand. Because see, what happens is if you don't do that, an entity could be tempted to take all of your energy bill money, not invest in upgrading and keeping their system, and then when something goes sideways, you all of a sudden don't have electricity. Now, when you don't have electricity, all of productivity goes down. Interstate commerce gets affected. The reason that the FERC regulates the grid is because the grid affects interstate commerce. And we as Americans are real touchy about interstate commerce not working. By contrast, in Europe, for example, they have laws that really empower their unions, especially in the transportation world. And so you could have a great plan to travel to Europe or France or whatever, and then all of a sudden there'll be an airline strike or a garbage strike or a train strike, and you're like stuck. Europe decided that it wanted to empower unions in that way. The United States was like, not when it comes to transportation. Why? Because transportation affects interstate commerce. So in the United States, we have an actually separate law that applies to transportation companies and unions in transportation environments, so that we have few, if any, work stoppages in transportation, because we did not want to tolerate the disruption of interstate commerce. That's just a fact about the sort of American business spirit, if you will, right? But the reliability of electricity is another component to the stability of interstate commerce in our country. So a long time ago, we decided that we're going to have uniform standards for the suppliers of energy so that you wouldn't get a city going down, right? Because that city may need to be able to receive airline flights, or it may be able to send off its, beef to some other city, right? That's relying on that. We as a country function by giving and taking across state lines, and it requires electricity to do that. So what has happened in Texas, though, is they said, well, we don't want to be held to these standards with respect to reinvestment in our infrastructure. We want to just reap the profits and then, send them into the ether, to the bank accounts of our executives, so that it just disappears, and we will not continue to upgrade our facilities. So when the Arctic freeze came, they got caught flat-footed. Is it true that wind turbines do not work in cold weather? No, it is not. What is true is that they did not make the equipment investments to ensure that their wind turbines could work in any weather. Because there are wind turbines in Antarctica and in Alaska, right? So no, it's not true that wind turbines don't work in cold weather. Is it true that wind turbines are responsible for the lack of energy production? No, because 90% or like 88% of Texas is on natural gas and oil. So it had nothing to do with wind turbines. It had nothing to do with the Green New Deal. A lot of what happened was that the liquefied natural gas pipelines burst. That's the problem. Why? Because they did not invest in the insulation in the system to keep those natural gas pipelines secure and impervious to the weather, right? What's happening in Texas is not just a failure of regulation. It's a failure of preparation. It's a failure of policy. It's a failure of leadership. It's like everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But the reason I want to talk about privatization is because this theory was sold to Texans and others that private industry and unregulation and making it a business proposition was the absolute way to go to guarantee quality and reliability. And I'm here to tell you that there is a very important component that is missed in that conversation, right? The component that makes a private entity a good entity is competition, right? Private entities become better at what they do when they have to compete with other private entities for your business. So If you're a private entity and you make burgers, and there's a whole lot of burgers out there, you're going to be constantly working on making your burgers better because you want to out-burger your opponents, right? Your competitors. But there's a kind of industry in which you take out competition. And when you take out the element of competition, then there's really no incentive to make the product any better. At that point, the incentive devolves to profit, right? If I don't have to compete to make my product better, then the only thing I care about is how much money can I extract from that enterprise. Because let's be honest, all enterprise is about making money. If you are in the pizza business, you're in the money-making business. If you do hair, you're in the money-making business. If you own a landscaping company, you're in the money-making business, right? And if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have to do anything to make your product better, to make more money, then you're not going to. Why would you? Right? Because pouring money into your product is overhead. And overhead is what causes you to produce profits. So, the key component to the very idea of private enterprise is competition. Absent competition, private enterprise is just usurpation. So what happens when you have an electrical grid, for example, that is not regulated, privatized, but has no competition? Every decision is made on how to extract profits out of that enterprise, and very little attention is paid to how to ameliorate the product that is sold. And the only thing that protects a consumer is the state regulations or the state regulators. And if they're in the pockets of the people making money from the enterprise, they treat that with kid gloves. That's what we call cyclical corruption. And I will tell you that it's not unique to Texas. If you went outside the United States, you would find a whole lot of enterprises that function like that, right? They get the benefit of sole market control, and then they are fashioned as a private entity with no competition. That is the perfect formula for the abuse of consumers, because it becomes intoxicating to find out more and more and better ways of extracting profit out of the enterprise, putting as little into it as you possibly can. And that's what has happened in Texas. I want you to understand this because this has been a meme. This has been a thing that has been sold by people up and down the GOP sphere, that the best way to do anything is in the business model. The best way to do anything is in the private model, and that's just total bullshit. The only time a private business model works for anything is when there's real competition. Absent competition, it is rife with abuse. Number one. Number two, there are some services that are just not suited for a private structure because they provide a service, and building a profit motive into the service is counter to the intention. For example, incarceration. Incarceration is a public service, theoretically, right? You do not want to build into incarceration a profit motive, because what happens is you start to come up with creative reasons to put more heads in jail. If you make more money with more heads in jail, you're going to find ways of putting more heads in jail. That's wrong. That is counter to the policy intention here. Same thing with public education. Yeah, you can have private educational institutions, fine. And quite frankly, there is competition in private education. There are lots of cities that have multiple private schools, and they compete against each other, and that competition sort of keeps up the standard. But if you're saying, hey, we're just going to privatize all public education, then guess what? All of a sudden, that no longer becomes a service. And they stop investing in how good it is and start thinking about how much money they can extract out of it. That is what people need to understand about privatization. I think I want to take some time today to talk about that, because not understanding that, it sounds very seductive to say, oh, business is so much more efficient. Business is so much better at doing, innovation and R&D, and they go out there and they get innovative. Yeah, when there's competition, right? Moderna and Pfizer were actually competing against each other on the vaccine. They knew that they were all working on it. And one wanted to get to market faster than the other. But they knew that they were going to be competing against each other. That caused them to pour the energy into putting that vaccine together and getting it out and getting it approved. Great. But when we turn around and say, okay, and so what we're going to do is, if there was a purely private model on the vaccine right now, guess what? The only people who would be getting the vaccine are the people who could afford it. And they would charge up the nose for it. They would charge whatever they could get away with. It is government that is prohibiting those entities from charging out the nose for those vaccines. Absent that government control, they would have charged $500 a shot. Easily. And would have justified it. Hey, that's what it took. We poured billions of dollars into research and development. Look at all of this, They would have said it. So anybody who couldn't afford $500 wouldn't get vaccinated. That's the way the Trump administration wanted it to be. Luckily, it didn't go down like that. But I want you to understand the concept behind privatization. I'm not saying that business is bad, and I'm not saying that making money is bad, but it is not right for everything. Perfect example is the United States Postal Service. The USPS delivers mail in boondocks and backwaters that no other business would bother with because it's not profitable. If you got some corner of like Louisville, Pennsylvania, where you got one house every half a mile, nobody's going to put Wi-Fi infrastructure there because it takes too much money to cover that much turf, and there's too few houses from which you can derive profit. They would never do it. But the thing is, those houses still need that service, right? FedEx does not deliver in Louisville, nor does UPS. Why? Because it would take them forever to get out there. You know what they do? They give their packages to the USPS, and they deliver the packages to those rural communities. The United States Postal Service is just that, a service. And the Founding Fathers understood that it was such a critical component to the success of the United States that they enshrined it in the Constitution. And since the 1970s, the GOP has been attacking the U.S. Postal Service and undermining it and put in a piece of legislation that was total crap to make sure that it couldn't compete financially with the FedEx and the UPS of the world. UPS is unionized. For the longest time, FedEx was not. But USPS was unionized up, down, and sideways. That is why the GOP hated it, because it hated the fact that the U.S. Postal Service was empowering these big, functional unions. So it spent decades demonizing the Postal Service and telling us how bad it sucks. And then they put in Louis DeJoy, who proved to us how good it really was. Because when he got his hands on it, he broke it. And then we began to realize how awesome it was to have the U.S. Postal Service that was fast and reliable and cheap and went everywhere. And the postal carriers that came to everybody's address, knew their communities. Now we were like, oh man, we value that USPS. Well, the reason we have a USPS and the reason it's worth valuing is that it wasn't built entirely on a profit margin. It was built on a service process, right? It renders a service to the people of the United States. And it is perfectly okay if it doesn't make a profit. I don't care. If my tax dollars support the USPS, so be it. I'm good with it. Okay. I would rather my tax dollars support the USPS than some of the other things my tax dollars have gone to, like boondoggles to trillionaires. The reality is that our country functions because we've decided that some things are important for it to function. Those things are called services. And electricity is one of those things. Now, it's fine to have private companies provide electricity, so long as they understand they're providing a critical service. They're not just in a money-making business. And that is what federal regulations do. They strike the balance between a private company making a buck and it actually serving the people in the way that it was intended. That is what regulation does. So the next time somebody says, oh, it's federal regulations and red tape, it's like, yeah, all you're trying to say is you don't like the things that protect the interest of the consumers and the taxpayers. Because that's what regulations do. For years, we have heard the GOP demonize regulation as the thing that hurts business. What we've not done as Democrats successfully is say regulations protect consumers, they protect citizens, they protect environment, they protect people. Regulation is what balances the books. Regulations are not necessarily bad. In fact, most of them are very good, and most of them come into being to fix a problem that has manifest. Right? If you think that Texas's grid is the first in American history to go catastrophically down, you are wrong. Right? There have been major blackouts in U.S. history. There was one in New York in the 60s that was like massive. And in fact, there was like a baby boom that came out of that. But there was a massive blackout in New York, right? The regulations that were written out of that experience are the regulations that now apply and regulate our grid to avoid the next massive blackout. That's how regulation comes to be. And that's why I wanted you to understand what you were hearing when you hear Republicans talk about, we didn't want federal regulation. We didn't want Washington controlling our grid. No, because you wanted to rip off the Texas people of money without investing in their grid. That's why you didn't want anybody to force you to upgrade your facilities and to stay on top of technology so that you would actually serve the population you were supposed to serve. I want you to understand what they're saying, because they use these platitudes and they get repeated by people like Fox News, and they don't ever tell you what it really means. But this is the place where I'm going to tell you what it really means. What it really means is deregulation and keeping regulators out of our business is another way of saying let us abuse the consumers, pull out all the money that we can without reinvesting in the infrastructure to ensure that the consumers have something they can rely on. I hope I've explained that in a way that makes sense to you. But this is a theme that's going to come up over and over again, because it's a fundamental disagreement in the way that the Democrats and Republicans look at governing and look at everything, basically, right? We believe that the purpose of government is to make sure that America works for its people. GOP thinks that the purpose of government is to make sure that the rules inure to the benefit of the wealthy. And they're not even trying to pretend otherwise. They're not interested in governing. And they're not interested in governing in the interest of the people. They're interested in using government to hold power and to siphon money into their hands. And they've said so in every conceivable way. So when they tell us that, let's believe them. And never, ever, ever vote for them again. If you like what you just heard, you can find out so much more and hear so much more on my Patreon channel, patreon.com/Pam Keith FL. That's where you hear the rest of this discussion, and there's lots more to share.